I want to say welcome to everybody. It's good to see many familiar faces in this space. I am so pleased to introduce Angelica Ramos to you today as she gives her talk, Three Strikes and You're Out of Funding. And this is a research talk based on a topic that she's been committed to over many years. So when I think about what brings people to their research, there are many personal commitments, political commitments, and educational commitments. Angelica, on a personal note, is one of a current student on campus that I've known the longest. Other students who I've also known as long, but they're in different roles now. But I've known her for 4 years, and her commitments just keep growing and growing in the way she does her work. Which is just wonderful to see and wonderful to know for the people and communities her research serves. So this research is a Levitt Summer Fellowship, which is very competitive and prestigious, as you all know. It builds on last year's Emerson research, or is a link to. So 50 years later, a look into the lives of Mexican-American students in East LA post-Chicano movements. She's linking this current research to her senior thesis right now, looking at the ways charter schools have affected communities of color in LA again. So just wonderful to see how those research pieces have all linked together in the story that you are telling and the communities that you're serving. Angelica is a social justice education major. I said this last year when I introduced her for her Emerson talk, but she designed this major, so she will go down in the history of Hamilton College as the first social justice education major, a major she completely created on her own. So in that way, she has changed the story of this institution by creating this major and by drawing many people to focus on topics that otherwise may have been ignored. So this research is also a testament to that. She's a secretary of the Feminist of Color Collective. She's a diversity recruitment intern. And I know she has my complete respect and admiration, and I can't wait to hear your talk, and I know others can't either. So it's a privilege again to introduce Angelica to you. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me, by the way? Yeah? Okay. I'm a little nervous. But thank you for coming to my talk. As Professor Madden said, my name is Angelica Ramos. I think a lot of you already knew that. I'm a senior here, social justice education major, and I'm here to present my research project called Three Strikes and You're Out of Funding. Just to explain quickly, like the title, Three Strikes refers to the three strikes in the three teacher strikes in LA's history, one in 1970, another in 1989, and the last one last year in 2019. And so that's kind of like what I mean. And out of funding is like that's really what the district says every time the teachers strike, is that they don't have the funding to provide the resources. So yeah. Just to give a little background before I really delve into it, talking a little bit about my identities and why I chose this project. I am an indigenous Chicana. No, I'm not Latinx. No, I'm not Hispanic. Those are two different things, but that's a whole other conversation I don't want to go into. I'm a resident of Boyle Heights, East LA. I grew up there. That's where I'm always going back, and that's where I plan on going back after graduation. Maybe staying there for the rest of my life. Honestly, that's kind of a goal. I attended LAUSD public schools for my K through 12, so that's also a part of the reason why I chose this project, is that it's so personal to me. And then finally, I participated in the 2019 strike in January of last year, and so that's also why, like in participating in the strike, that's kind of like what led me to even creating this project, was just seeing the educators that were on strike, and then just like hearing a little bit of the testimonies, because every single teacher that was on strike was my elementary, middle school, and high school teacher. And so not only was I able to reconnect with them after so many years, I was also able to just kind of hear their story and just be inspired by like why they do what they do. And so why this project, again, like as Professor Madden said, it has connections to my past research and also to future research that I'm doing. So in other words, my thesis. I'm also going to be going to grad school, hopefully to get a PhD, and this will also extend into what I would do for my dissertation. And so like it's definitely like an ongoing project. I don't just do projects, forget about it, and then leave it behind, because I know the damage that research projects do, especially to vulnerable or marginalized communities. That's definitely not my intention, which is why I see this as like an ongoing thing that will extend beyond my research. And again, personal connections. So aside from going to these schools and knowing these educators, like also because it is in my city and it is a topic, social justice education, that's so important to me. That's also why I really just wanted to delve into this project and see what I could learn. Okay, so just like to kind of just jump in, give a brief history of the LA teacher strikes. The first strike was in 1970. This one lasted about a month, from April to May, which means that for a month, these students in LAUSD weren't going to school, or were going to school but didn't have teachers present. And so the major demands here were just like teacher salary increases, smaller class sizes, and quality reading programs. And so after a month of negotiations, the outcomes were a 6.5% pay raise, more personnel at low-income schools, and a prep period for elementary school teachers. And the prep period was really because elementary school teachers at the time had classes all day, every day without a break. And so after the strike, elementary school teachers were able to have like a period or like an hour or so where they were able to, kind of breathe, but also prepare their lesson plans more effectively. And then 19 years later, you had the 1989 teacher strike, which is the one I'll be focusing on more. This one lasted for 10 days in May, and the main demand was a 12.1% pay raise. They had other smaller demands, but really like the essence of the 1989 teacher strike was focused on teacher pay raise and teacher working conditions. And so the outcome of this strike after 10 days of negotiation was a 24% pay raise over 3 years. So it was an 8% increase every year for 3 years. The elimination of yard duty. So a lot of teachers, if like a school had a community garden, they were in charge of like taking care of that, maintaining that, and then like also cleaning like playgrounds and things like that, which is like teachers were arguing is not part of their job necessarily, and like they have like other custodial staff who like need those jobs, who want to be paid for that, and so that was an outcome of the strike, along with more school-based management programs, which schools could opt into doing if they didn't want to be necessarily too controlled by the district. However, something interesting about the 1989 teacher strike was that they consider it a short-lived success because in 1992, 3 years later, California had a recession, so a lot of the 24% pay raise that teachers had was kind of just like taken away, basically, not through the district, but because of the recession that happened in California. And so then 30 years later, you had the 2019 UTLA strike that happened between January 14th and January 20th of last year. But honestly, like, it's kind of, that's like the actual strike, but there was months, almost a year of negotiations that happened even before the strike occurred. So honestly, like, you can argue that this was kind of like a year-long process. And then the demands here changed a lot. As you can see, like, aside from a pay raise, it kind of echoed a little bit of what the 1970 strike wanted, which was smaller class sizes, but then it also incorporated more student learning environments and the conditions that public school students face. So they wanted more full-time counselors, nurses, and librarians, along with standardized test reductions and a cap on charter school growth. So after the 1989 strike, during the 1990s and the early 2000s, you had the rise in neoliberalism on a global scale, and that meant the rise of privatization in education. And so after the 1989 strike, you had a lot of increases in charter schools in LA, which then became the main focal point for the 2019 strike because, as I'll talk about later, charter schools were having negative effects on LAUSD public education. And so again, after 6 days of being on strike and negotiations, the outcomes of this were a 6% salary increase. And I just want to highlight how low this percentage is. This is kind of, and this is something I will be explaining throughout the presentation, is that the main reason these teachers went on strike isn't for a pay raise. Like, that's a misconception that a lot of people have, those in LA and those outside of LA, that teachers are only there for like selfish reasons of like, oh, I want to get bigger paycheck. Really, like, they were actually fighting for everything that students needed in public schooling, and so they were also able to get a nurse and librarian at every school. The elimination of Section 1.5, which is a section in part of LAUSD. LAUSD stands for Los Angeles Unified School District. But that section basically says that there is really no cap on how many students are allowed in English and math classes, and that it was up to the school's discretion. And so because of this, a lot of public schools in LA had like 50, 60 students in English and math classes because of this section. And so by eliminating that section, they were able to actually set a cap of 39 students in English and math classes, which is still a lot. That's more than there are people in this room. But again, like they were, I guess, and that's like something that's like up for debate still. But working with like what the resources and money that public schools have, 39 seem to be the most, like I guess the best number for that. And then finally there was a moratorium on charter schools, which means just like a temporary, not ban, but I would say like a temporary pause on like accepting proposals for new charter schools. So right now the district is not accepting new proposals until more research is done on like the benefits and or negative aspects of charter schools in LA. And so basically my research topic and my research questions, my overall thesis is this research aims to serve as a comparative analysis of the 1989 and 2019 UTLA strikes so that we may better understand the progress and lack thereof in Los Angeles public education. And really this kind of like echoes the research that I had last year where I was comparing school conditions in LA currently to what happened 50 years ago when the student movement occurred. And so that's kind of like the similar logic that I have here is like, you know, they had a strike now, but what has changed or what stayed the same now as like in 30 years ago since the demands kind of like were similar, but also like a lot of the teachers were the same teachers who went on strike. So it's like, why did they want to go and do that again? And so my questions that I'm really focusing on are what are the intersecting roles of teacher unions and social media in the 1989 and 2019 teacher strikes in Los Angeles? How was solidarity formed or affected by differing accesses to political activism? And what are the deeper implications of charters and business models in public education? For my methodology, so like I've always done interviews because I love to center like personal testimonies of marginalized groups to also like not I'm not empowering their voices, rather I'm just giving a space where they can actually speak, because in academia that's something that's not necessarily centered. That along with the amount of social media that I saw during the 2019 UTLA strikes kind of pushed me to make this project a qualitative multi-method study. So of course I had interviews. I had 10 in-depth interviews with educators, all public school educators, activists, union workers, etc. And they were kind of just like telling me about like their experience of going on strike and like why they did it, and also those who may not have necessarily supported it, but went to like observe and like learn anyway. And then I also had content analysis, so I had to look through a lot of archives, but I was finding newspaper articles of the 1989 teacher strikes, and like just like looking at the language that was used, the rhetoric that was used to talk about these teachers, and what that kind of revealed about the strike itself. And then for the 2019 strike, I looked at a lot of online news articles, because nowadays you don't have like print newspapers, you can look at them on the internet. So I was Googling a lot of that and just like collecting news articles from like, I don't know, the LA Times, New York Times, Chicago Tribune, Daily Mail, you know, all these random news articles. Whereas like in the 1989 strike, all the newspaper articles I collected are from specifically the LA Times, because a lot of international newspapers weren't necessarily covering it in depth, and that's why I focused more on LA Times for 1989. And then for 2019, I also collected social media posts, because they had such a strong social media presence for the 2019 strike. So I went to UTLA's Instagram page, Twitter page, along with looking at what other people had posted, and kind of like analyzing the strike through that lens as well. So in total, all of that led to 5 major themes: media as a weapon and a tool for solidarity, professionalization of teaching, cracks within the movement, school-community relations, and charters as a colonial legacy. And for the sake of the presentation, I'll only be talking about 3 themes. The first one, media as a weapon; the second, cracks within the movement; and the third one, charters as a colonial legacy. Yeah. And so just kind of to begin, my first theme, media as a weapon and a tool for solidarity. This theme kind of revealed the negative rhetoric in the news media to describe teachers and the UTLA strikes both in 1989 and 2019. thereby enforcing this systemic power of corporate media over teacher voices and personal testimonies. And so in 1989, there was a lot of negative media coverage that led to violence, physical violence, like on teachers, from those who did not necessarily support the strikes. And it really explores how social media played a vital role in mitigating these violent attacks, but also building more support for the 2019 strike. And I'll kind of, which then flips the formerly oppressive power of like corporate media over teacher voices, where it kind of like equalizes it, but if not, like even puts the teacher voices above like what the corporate media is saying. And so for my first sub-theme, negative media coverage, I'm going to read these two quotes, both from news articles that cover the 2019 strike. And they say, the LA fight involves union leaders representing reasonably well-paid teachers arguing for a substantial retroactive pay bump in language that's draped in sweeping rhetoric about corporatism and privatization. Last month in March, a Sylmar Junior High School English teacher was stabbed during class by one of her students, and a popular Grant High School teacher was shot to death in front of his Sherman Oaks home by an unknown assassin. The second quote is actually from 1989. And so both are kind of, well, mainly the first quote is characterized by a dismissive critique to denounce teachers' efforts and their decision to strike, and kind of to place their voices at the bottom of a hierarchy in education, as in, why are you striking? You know, you're getting paid pretty well, and you're talking a lot about privatization and corporatism without really knowing what it means, and so kind of dismissing their efforts. However, the 1989 news coverage, as you can see through the second quote, is led to these extremely violent attacks on teachers that then came sometimes at the expense of their own lives. And I mean, aside from that, like not even to bring attention away from these violent attacks on teachers, but what later ended up happening was that LAUSD passed a bill, Bill SB 142, that basically stated that any public school student, specifically Black, Indigenous students of color, specifically those with a criminal record, were to be viewed as a threat and feared by any teacher. And so in this discussion of these violent attacks that were happening on teachers, LAUSD and the general public found it, or mainly the corporate media found it justifying why they would further criminalize students of color, which then led to the oppression of these two already vulnerable groups. And so in 2019, you saw kind of a decrease in these violent attacks, and that kind of leads to my second sub-theme, is the role of social media. And so social media here played a key role in not only mitigating these violent attacks, but also humanizing the teachers and better communicating why they decided to strike. So for example, Mr. Leyenda, a public school librarian that I interviewed, said, oh, I have this clicker. He says, so people were more aware, were much more aware a lot of the times of what's happening in the schools, what's going on, what shortages are. And so social media played that was one of the big differences between the two strikes. So the previous strike, even though, yes, you had some of the same things going on, the messages may not necessarily get out as well to the public as it would now. He's speaking mainly from the perspective, because he was in both the 1989 and 2019 strikes. And so in reflecting on both of those strikes, he was saying that social media definitely played a big role in communicating why teachers were striking even months before the strike had occurred. And so UTLA has over 27,000 followers on Instagram and over 21,000 followers on Twitter, which means anything that they tweet and any personal testimonies and updates on any negotiations was coming directly from them to a very broad general audience, not just in LA, but internationally. And so in this ways, like social media was used as like a form of autonomy where disempowered groups like UTLA and individual teachers were able to share their stories at their own disposal. And honestly, you could kind of argue that because they were able to better publicly share their voice, social media then became a form of like legitimate news where, you know, they were looking at UTLA's tweets as reliable and as legitimate as, let's say, something that like the LA Times had published. And so in these ways, teachers were able to gain control and autonomy over their own stories and like what they wanted to communicate to the public, which then like resulted in stronger solidarity within teachers and also like with teachers to the public. However, social media wasn't entirely enough to build this unbreakable solidarity, and this kind of leads to my next theme, cracks within the movement. And this theme focuses a lot on capitalism as like this hovering force that aims to weaken movements as they occur and even before they occur. And then within the UTLA strikes in 1989 to 2019, it showed to divide teachers between those who wanted to go on strike and those who said no. And so here I also explore like the differing accesses to sacrifice that result in teachers who decided to not go on strike, and a wavering solidarity between the teachers. So for this first subtheme, the force of capitalism in the strike, this is a quote by a news article in 1989 that said, "Although some viewed the move to strike as an advantage for coaches, most criticized the action, saying that it would force them to choose between supporting their teams or their colleagues. In a strike situation, nobody wins," he said. "It leaves a bitter taste and splits faculties. But my gut feeling is that I can't let my team down. I don't know what that means yet, but I can't let them down." And so teachers in 1989 and 2019 had to choose between supporting their students or going on strike and supporting their colleagues. However, like something different to note is that in the 1989 strike, because it was so focused on teacher working conditions, teachers who decided to go on strike were really doing it for a higher pay raise and not necessarily for the benefit of their students. And whereas like in 2019, you do have teachers who are going on strike for better learning environment and better conditions for public school students. And so that's kind of like where the difference lies, and how that influences the discussions that non-striking teachers have or had 30 years ago versus what they had last year. But the reality of a strike means that a teacher is absent from the classroom for an unknown period of time. No one knows how long a strike is going to last. It could either be a month or a week. And so in making this decision, teachers also have to take that into consideration. But it also kind of raises this question of like why teachers even have to choose between their students and their rights in the first place. Like it's actually kind of cruel that that has to happen. But unfortunately, like forces like capitalism force teachers to kind of start doing this cost-benefit analysis where it's like, what are the immediate costs if I want to go on strike, in this case, which is students don't have you present in the classroom, versus like what the long-term benefits would be. And in 1989, it meant better pay raise, and in 2019, it meant better pay raise, but also like more counselors for my students. And just to kind of give you more information on like the differences between 1989 and 2019. This picture here in the middle, it's in Spanish, but that teacher is holding a poster that basically says the striking teacher is also teaching. It sounds better in Spanish because it rhymes, but basically like in 2019 there was a lot of discussion of how striking and like being absent from the classroom isn't necessarily a bad thing, because that itself like is a statement. Educators who are fighting for their rights like are exercising their political activism, and like they're kind of demonstrating what that means to their students. And it's very significant in LA specifically because LA has a history of student movements, and so a lot of students were in favor of these teacher strikings because they knew that it reflected things that they did not even 50 years ago. And so that's kind of like how it all happened. However, not all teachers saw it this way. A lot of teachers, even in 2019, didn't want to go on strike because it also meant that they would have to go without pay. And I wasn't able to interview a lot of non-striking teachers. Part of the reason is because a lot of them didn't really want to talk about the strike. They were kind of just like, look, I didn't do it, that's it. But another part was because they were, a lot of them were like kind of shamed because they chose not to strike. And I thought this was actually very interesting, and so I wanted to kind of explore that more. And I also wanted to shed a little bit of light on those teachers who did not strike, because it didn't necessarily mean that they didn't care, but maybe there were other reasons behind that. I keep forgetting this. And so that kind of leads to my second sub-theme, what I call access to sacrifice. And to kind of re-explain what I was talking about now, Miss Romero, a public school counselor, says, I mean, it was really disappointing, and it's been a little awkward since then because, like, it's almost like they didn't support us, so they don't necessarily care about, our students. So it's been it's been tough being around those particular teachers since then. And so, yes, she expresses the same disappointment that teachers in 1989 must have faced when some of their colleagues or other teachers decided not to go on strike, and decided to cross the picket line. And however, her language of, it's a little disappointing because if they don't support us, they don't care about our students. And it kind of again, perpetuates the narrative that any teacher who is not on the picket line holding a poster does not care about their students. And how in 2019 striking with the teachers was more telling of a commitment that you had to your students and public education as a whole, whereas in 2019 it was more what commitment did you have to your pay raise and the professionalization of teaching. However, this same point brings up another conversation that's embodied in this quote, news quote about the 2019 strike. And it says, even the teachers' 98% vote in favor of a strike may be less than rock solid when it is tested without paychecks. How long will LAUSD teachers be willing to stay out on strike to achieve constraints on charter schools? So because teachers were fighting for a pay raise in 1989 and 2019, this meant that they were already not getting paid enough to begin with and are still not getting paid enough to begin with. And however, going on strike means that those days that you're on strike are also days that you're not getting paid. So every day they're losing like hundreds of dollars. And depending on how long the strike lasts, so for example, in this past strike, it was 6 days, and a couple $100 every day is a lot of money. And so a lot of teachers who chose not to strike may have done so because they could not financially, they did not have the financial stability to do so. And I'm not trying to vindicate, but I'm also not trying to incriminate those teachers who did not go on strike. Rather, I'm trying to call in more dialogue as to like the capitalism and the classism that's behind the many reasons why teachers don't want to go on strike. And it kind of uncovers the differing accesses to sacrifices among individuals of different marginalized identities. And so it also raises the question around like what we even consider to be activism. So if a teacher cannot financially afford to go on strike, are you going to get mad at them for doing so and ignore the fact that they couldn't afford it? And does that then imply that being on strike and being on the picket line is the only way that you can fight for your rights? And also asking yourself, like who even has access to certain political actions, and then really delving into the different forms of activism that we see today. Also, LA is very expensive to live in, so even taking that into consideration, like that could be your rent, that could be, I don't know, like your clothes, your utility bills, and so that itself like kind of heightened the tensions between those who went on strike and those who didn't. So capitalism in general is just the driving force of all oppression. And speaking of capitalism, that leads me to my last theme, charter schools. Specifically charter schools as colonial legacies. And so this theme covers the takeover of charter schools in LAUSD at the expense of public schools through tactics of co-location and privatization. And I will define what co-location is in just a moment. This theme also investigates the management of charter schools as upholding notions of white supremacy, and then also examines the partial public support of charter schools because it's kind of like up in the air. There's a lot of debate about it. As a sign of a need to reinvest in public schooling. And just because I'm curious, how many people went to a charter school? Okay. Okay. I'm not going to assume what your experiences were, whether positive or negative at the charter schools, but in case that you did, like, just know that I am not here to talk about any success stories, and I'm not here to talk about the benefits that charter schools claim to have on Black Indigenous communities of color. I'm here to criticize the management and admissions of charter schools and the negative impacts that they have had on Black Indigenous communities of color, specifically low-income communities. And so kind of just to start, co-location as colonization. This is a quote by Mr. Moreno, who is a longtime Boyle Heights activist. He's actually in this picture. And what he says is, so years ago, the charter school industry got a bill passed in Sacramento that if there were any empty spaces in the schools, that they can come in and take them over. And then more and more and more, and boom, they got half the school. Additionally, a news article in 2019 said, last month, UTLA called for an immediate cap on charter school growth in LAUSD, calling for an end to the unsustainable, destructive practice of unregulated charter school growth. And so in these two quotes, and also in the picture, you can see that charters are physically colonizing public school territory. And honestly, you can even argue, and this is something that I further explore in my thesis, that charter schools are settler colonial institutions that not only take over public school territory, but also push out public school campuses and public school Black, Indigenous students of color. And so kind of like just to explain Mr. Moreno's point and like what co-location is, so there's a law called California Proposition 39 that legally allows charter schools or charter corporations to come in to a public school, and if there's like an empty classroom, the charter corporation can buy that classroom and say, okay, we're going to establish like a charter school here, and if they see other empty spaces on that like campus, they can buy that too, and eventually like they'll buy like a whole building, and if they manage to get a hold of a whole building, because a lot of them are run by corporates, Netflix, and California Charter School Association, those are the two main ones that are affecting LA, they can afford to buy out the whole public school legally, but not really legally, and so as of that, so it's like in the midst of buying out that school, you have like co-location, where it's like one physical campus, but you have a charter school and a public school sharing that campus, but really it's like the charter taking over and slowly eating away at the public school. So it's pretty destructive, and that's also like why UTLA claims that this unregulated charter school growth has been destructive to existing LAUSD public schools, because LAUSD has failed to actually, monitor these takeovers. And even stand in defense of the public schooling. And so Mr. Moreno really calls co-location like a strategy that's used by the charter corporations to take over public school campuses. And it's honestly a literal push out and displacement, not only of public schools, but of public school students, specifically Black, Indigenous students of color, that make up more than 80% of LAUSD. And so a lot of LAUSD students are then leaving behind the public schooling to go to charters nearby or on the same location as their previous public schools. And in this way, public schools are really just pushed down to the ground to serve as fertile soil for charter school growth. And so what does that mean for students then? And that's what I call. That's why I say that charter schools uphold notions of white supremacy. Yes, I intentionally did not capitalize white. And basically, like, what this means for students, as said by two public school teachers, Mr. Castro, who is a public high school history teacher, who says, I think the charter schools, they have the opportunity to cherry pick students. And they also sometimes deny services to students with disabilities because they want to save money. A lot of times they run the charter schools like private businesses, and they get the public taxes, like our tax dollars, for the school. So they give to those students that have high grades and no behavior issues. Mr. Alienda, the same public school librarian I previously quoted, says, we have a very large special ed program because charters, won't take them. If a kid is a troublemaker, or if they are not up to par, then they can dismiss them and they will come over here. They end up here. So the people they think they are, like, that they're disposing of, and I hate to say that they're disposing of kids, but that's basically what they do. And then we take them, we try to work with them. And so, aiming to make a profit and keep their doors open with high test scores, charter school admissions and management perpetuate a capitalist, white supremacist, and ableist agenda in which students who are not disabled, students who are disabled or have special needs, who are I'm taking that back. Students who are not disabled, high achieving and well behaved, are viewed as fit and up to par for these schools, because a lot of charter schools can only stay open if they have high test scores. And any student who does not fit into this ideal mold is then sent back to the public school. And if it's in the case of like a charter taking over a public school campus, they're just sent to another public school who will open their doors for them, and actually give them and will actually be willing to spend the money and resources to give these students any needs that will actually help them succeed. And so Mr. Leyenda says, well, a lot of these charter schools are supposed to be like public schools, because some charters do advertise themselves as public schools. They don't necessarily by law have to accept any student that they don't see fit, or that they see like potentially ruining their test scores, and so they can deny them and not suffer any consequences and continue doing what they do. And so this disposing of kids, what Mr. Leander calls disposing of kids, perpetuates the idea of like what type of student people view as like worthy of investing in, and also like what characteristics in a student is actually valued in the classroom environment. And so obviously charters focus less on what students need and more on what they need in order to keep their doors open, and to be viewed as successful in low-income Black, Indigenous communities of color. And so because of this, I do argue that charter schools can be a seller, or like are settler colonial institutions that displace public schools and Black, Indigenous students of color. And this theme really highlights this need to reinvest in public schooling, specifically in LAUSD, but also all over the U.S., because public schooling for so long has actually been one of the only systems and resources that actually open their doors to students regardless of their identities and their abilities. And this discussion of the rise of charter schools has led to a rise in like school choice. And anyone who studies education knows that a lot of the times it's an illusion or it comes with strings attached. But honestly, for a lot of low-income Black, Indigenous families of color, like charter schools are viewed as like a great option, like a better option than any neighboring public schools. But unfortunately, like their support has led to the perpetuation of this negative stigma around public schooling. And so again, like for those who went to charter schools, like maybe you went there for different reasons, but maybe you did go there because like that was your only option. And so that's why I want to make sure that I'm not, like I want to be clear that I am not criticizing or looking down upon those families who choose to support charter schools, because they should not be blamed for doing so. Rather, their support should serve as a wake-up call for LAUSD, other public school officials, and public school education policymakers to revolutionize the way that they are managing and running their public schools so that it can actually serve and provide high-quality, equitable education for students, specifically those with marginalized identities and backgrounds. I keep doing this. So, for my conclusion and recommendations, the main takeaways from this project is that social media, especially now in the digital age, has a vital and useful role in social movements and building solidarity among different groups of people, those who are near the social movement, but those who are maybe abroad. There's also a need for a transformation on how we even view activism and political involvement. So, now you have what we call activism on social media, and how some activists, use their Instagram page or their Twitter page to spread news, or how even we do that. And so just more discussions around that and like what we view as like legitimate activism, and how we value different bodies as well. And then finally, charter schools as upholding notions of white supremacy through co-location and privatization. And then just some recommendations for future research. More research on organizing tactics and educational movements, because I thought this conversation of how social media played a huge role in the way that UTLA's strike formed was was honestly just very interesting, because of like the way that it's like you don't need the physical presence of an activist in order to be involved in a political movement. There also should be more research on the international perspective of educational movements, and that's kind of something I'm doing with my thesis, looking at Chile and Argentina's history of educational movements and seeing like what the U.S. Can learn from those movements, but also like what we can potentially contribute to movements abroad. And then finally, more research on benefits or the harms of corporate-sponsored charters in low-income communities of color. There's already like very mixed research on this, but definitely like a lot of that research has more to do with like the mission values of charter schools and like just the initial years where a charter school is opening, but there isn't enough research on like what co-location means for public schooling and like what it means for students who then aren't even welcomed in charter schools. And then just like a recommendation for us, kind of echoing the same sentiments that Erica Hart had said a couple weeks ago when she came to campus, is that there definitely needs to be a lot more community building. So listening to each other, caring for each other, but also specifically listening and centering the most marginalized groups within within any social movement. So Erica Hart had said that if it's not safe for Black femme, trans Black femme, then it's not safe for anyone. And so just remembering that, it's like who in certain spaces is not safe is not going to be centered. And if that's going to be the case, then no one is safe or will be centered in those discussions. So I want to thank you all so much for coming. Special thank you to Professor Madden for advising me throughout this whole process and also before and hopefully beyond. Thank you to my support system. You all know who you are. And thank you especially to the Black Indigenous educators of color who never stop fighting. And obviously I'm not talking about only those who went on strike, but those who are also in this very room and those who are way outside of LA. So yeah, thank you. Are there any questions, by the way?
This is a little bit more like thinking of the tactics that were used, like when you were talking about like what are the risks of like not showing up for class, both for like teachers and also for students. Were there any like strategies in place with teachers still finding ways to educate their students even if they were on strike, or like thinking like, I don't know, like if maybe like teachers did kind of like, okay, I'll go on strike on this day and you handle all the teaching, and then like the next day you'll go on strike and I'll handle the teaching to like help ensure that students are being taught?
Yeah, so actually in the 2019 strikes, the majority of students decided to not show up to school and were actually on strike with the teachers. So LAUSD lost millions of dollars every single day during the UTLA 2019 strike because students refused to show up. And if you have low student attendance, like for every student that misses, you lose money. And so students also view that as like a way to pressure LAUSD into negotiating. And so a lot of them decided to just not be in the classroom and be outside with the teachers. So like a lot of teachers would sometimes like consider like a little field trip, like, oh, okay, let's all like march around the school. And then like that itself like got students involved. So no, they may not have necessarily learned like the traditional material that they would have learned, like science, like math, but they were learning a ton of other valuable lessons, and the students definitely knew that when they were out on strike with the teachers. Yeah.
In terms of co-location, I'm curious who kind of like patrols the boundaries of like a campus and how that, like what that looks like in practice.
Yeah, so really public school campuses are overseen like by the public school itself and partially by the district, but because LAUSD has so many campuses that it's like hard to even really like patrol any of them or like reinforce like those boundaries. But public schools like at least like the administration of a public school will know like where, like what buildings, and a lot of the times like they'll like always be in the same block, so like it won't be like a Hamilton campus where it's all spread out. It'll just be like very like close knit. But yeah, like with co-location too, like no, because there wasn't a lot of enforcement to begin with. Like so when co-location happened, like no one was really, like LAUSD wasn't really paying attention and like didn't really care and brushed it off because they were like, it's just one school, and so that's what resulted in like a lot of charter takeovers in LAUSD. Yeah. Yeah.
I was in Chicago this past fall for the Chicago public school teacher strike that happened for 2 weeks, which is great. One of my best friends is a teacher there. One of the things that stood out to me was when I went to the local public schools in the suburbs of Chicago, there were a lot of teachers who were wearing shirts or signs in support of the strike there. So I'm curious if, when this was happening in LA with the charter schools, with the social media presence, did you notice any support or sense of solidarity there at all? Did they speak about that? Or was it totally silent?
About what was happening in Chicago?
No. like during the teacher strikes in LA, from the social media of either charter schools themselves or the teachers who work there, was there a sense of solidarity with the teachers in the public schools who are striking at all? And
From
was
the
that
charter school.
present in the social media?
From the charter schools, no. A lot of the California Charter School Association was very outright against UTLA and the strike in general. But what was interesting was like it didn't really any solidarity that came from charter schools wasn't from the administration. It was more from the parents who had their students in charter schools. So obviously there were a lot of families who went to charter schools who weren't in support of the strike because they thought, you know, you're bashing on our school and like we think it's a great option. But there were some families who said, you know what, my students only at this charter school because like they have no other choice. But honestly, like I'm very much in support of the strike. But in like my social media, like I guess like exploration, like I actually didn't see a lot of those types of posts where it was like charter school to public school support, which I thought was really interesting. I only knew it existed because I was physically there at the strikes and at the rallies, and like that's when I saw it. But on social media, that presence was very minimum. Yeah.
So going back to the media part, and you were talking about how members who are part of the strike use the media in a positive way. In your research, did you see any ways that social media was used in a negative manner to kind of, for people who were against the strike to kind of create news that wasn't real or kind of attack the strike in any way?
Yeah, so similar to like the charter answer, like a lot of, I did see some negative posts, but it like was very minimal. Like for every one negative post, there were like at least like 35 like positive ones. And I think what was really interesting is like even like Googling like social media posts about the strike, like a lot of them are overwhelmingly positive. And so a lot of like these like negative media posts that, you know, were aiming to attack the strike kind of just were also put like all the way were pushed down at the end, and were extremely outnumbered by like every single support of the UTLA strike. So I thought it was really interesting. If anything, there were a lot more posts and like memes about attacking charter schools than there were like any attacking public schools. Yeah. Yes.
I have a methods question. So I know you did in-depth interviews the previous summer.
Mm-hmm.
Did that experience change for you this time around? Was it different in any way for you in doing the process of interviews?
Yeah, it definitely was. Like because last year not last year, 2 years ago. Wow. I interviewed a lot of students who were like my age or like younger, and like there was definitely like a difference in power dynamics. So it's like when I interview like people who I'd gone to high school with, or like people who were just finishing high school, I could sense that they viewed me as like, oh, she's a researcher, like she's up here, and I was just like that's not really that's not at all what this is. And so students in the beginning of the interviews were like slightly more hesitant to open up to me, but then they like eventually got a little bit more comfortable and were like, oh, okay, like I can talk to you like as if you're my friend. And for some of them, like I was their friend. Whereas like for teachers, every time I interview them, like you can tell like they came in like I'm like more of like experts, and like I guess I don't know if it had to do with age or just like experience or like they're also like level of education, but a lot of them were like coming into these interviews like, okay, like ask me your questions and I'll give you my answers type thing. So yeah, it was interesting though. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
I wanted to see if, like, in the conversation about tension between teachers who strike and that didn't, if y'all, like, talked about it more and, like, recognize that in a movement people have different roles and, like, not everyone has to be outside. Like, it's important to be in different places and to do different things if you have the same cause.
Mhm.
So I'm wondering, like, well, if they didn't tell you, that doesn't mean that they don't know that, but
Mhm.
if y'all happen to like mention it.
Yeah, it was definitely not something that was really talked about, which is like why like I also like delved into it in this project, because like I was like, well, we're not talking about like differing reasons why teachers didn't strike. It was like if you're not out there on the picket line, it means you don't care. Because even like those teachers or like people who had differing like roles, like someone who was like the community organizer, like they were all, regardless of what their role was, like they were all still on the picket lines every single day. And so that's kind of like why I decided to critique that aspect of it, was because those discussions weren't being had, and because of that, like it was very much like of a binary. It's like either you strike or you don't, and if you strike, this is what this means, and if you don't strike, this is what that means. And so it was kind of like very much like there was no like reason why, like there was no no one wanting to ask a teacher like why they didn't go on strike. It was just, you didn't go on strike, and that means you don't care about us or our students. So it was very intense. And a part of me is like critiquing that, but a part of me like wants to somewhat like understand, because the teachers definitely were very stressed out. A lot of them were crying, and like during the 6 days of the 2019 strike, it was raining like heavily, and so a lot of people had fevers, a lot of people were very sick, but like still wanted to be out there. And so like they kind of had like this like no excuses mentality, and that kind of fostered like these negative sentiments toward those who chose not to strike. Yeah.
So this is more of a clarification. So you mentioned that sometimes families won't have a choice to go to a charter school, even though they might support like a public school or
Mhm.
might want to attend a public school for their child. And I was wondering, are there specific scenarios in which they would have to choose a charter school over a public school?
In which, yeah, so I mean it kind of goes back to like this discussion of like school choice, and like how the rise of charter schools has like meant like public schooling is viewed as like less, and so a lot of like low income families of color will view charter schools, and honestly like there's kind of just like this general sentiment of like, oh, you went to a charter school, and like automatically think that that's like better, and so a lot of families, not even just families of color, but even like white wealthy families, like will also buy into that narrative, and like will choose to like go to charter school over a public school. And also because there's been a lot of charter takeovers, there are some neighborhoods that only have charter schools around them and no public schools. So it's like, in that way, it's like I'm choosing to have my student be in this charter school rather than like driving like 20 minutes to go to the nearest public school. So there are like different like reasons why, and it gets really complicated. But yeah.
I'm sure it was, but like, were private schools part of the conversation? I guess to what extent, since it hasn't been brought up at all in the research? It's like, it's like a part of like the strike conversation, like were private schools
Yeah.
a big part of that?
Private schools actually were not a part of the conversation. I think the only talk about privatization was like the two types of charter schools. Like you have like the public charter schools, and you have like the privately run charter schools that are sponsored by like corporations like Netflix. And so like that was the only extent to which private schools were talked about. But like private schools, like just as private schools, like were definitely not in the conversation. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you for your research and your ongoing work on this topic. I wanted to ask, how did you feel as someone researching history but also witnessing history and being a part of it in terms of, you know, emotions, I guess the physicality of, being at the 2019 strike, and, because you were talking about things like weather, and I think those are a lot of things that are not really translated into research and academia, just the physical body and how that is withstanding the process of, being at your computer typing, but also engaging with these people, contributing, and all of those different facets of the humanness of it.
It was, well, I don't even know if I have the words to describe it. It was very emotional, I would say, because I did this project like in the summer after the strike, and so it was really just like having to, in some ways, like relive that history, like that was only a few months old. But it also like made me feel like, because I had to relive that, it made it feel like it was in the present, because a lot of teachers, while they're not like actually striking, like they're still negotiating with the district. And I think it was very emotional for me because, I mean, obviously I wasn't there. I wasn't even born yet when the 1989 strike happened. But just even talking to those teachers who were like there 30 years ago, well now 31 years ago, I think it was very, at least for me, like it just brought up a lot of emotions in terms of like like I know I come from a community with a legacy of activists and fighters, and like because of that, like it kind of, at least for me, like brought out that side of my history and like where I come from, and made me just also want to get more politically involved and like kind of transform like why I was even doing the research. I was like what am I actually doing this for? Like having to relive this history. Like this isn't just about like doing the research because I got like a summer research grant, but it was like doing the research because it's like my history as well, and also like it's the history of like, you know, like the people on the screen and the people like who I'm talking to on a daily basis. And so I don't know if that fully answers your question, because it's definitely it's definitely a loaded question, but I think like those were like the main things that were brought out for me. Yeah, it's like rethinking where I come from. And like what I want to do in the future as well. How do I keep this history ongoing? Because like again, like there's still a long way to go until like we reach like equitable education. So it's like, how do I want to carry this history with me? And like how do I want to make sure that that history isn't forgotten? Because sometimes that happens a lot, and that's why we repeat mistakes, and that's why like we're always fighting for the same things when it's like we did this 50 years ago, you know, like why are we doing this again? So yeah. No other question? Okay. Oh, yes.
Like, going off of that, with the students that participated and sort of were in the strike, how did you see, again, learning about this history and sort of like the teaching that was going while the teachers on strike? And like, you know, did it really differ from like the points of view you saw from the teachers, or?
And how they like relived like that history? Yeah. So a lot of teachers, at least like those who who were in the 1989 strike, definitely were like in some of the protests. Like for example, like I went to the ones at my high school. Like those teachers were the ones who were centered in the 2019 strike, and so a lot of them like would be like on the bullhorn, like talking about like their experience 30 years ago and like how like that should be a driving force for what they were doing last year. And so there was definitely like some talk of like what had happened in 1989, but in the end, and like students were like trying to engage with that, but in the end it's like students like wouldn't necessarily be pushed to like go and delve deeper into this history, like where I was doing like sitting through like finding newspaper articles, like they weren't necessarily pushed for that. And it's sad because a lot of students, and that's something I talked about in my last project, is like a lot of students don't even know the history of like the East LA walkouts that had happened, which were a student movement. And so like again, like you have like this recurring theme of like forgetting history, and like even when it's mentioned, it's not mentioned in a way that's like pushed where you want to go learn it. It was just like, oh, that happened, you know, that was a long time ago, we're going to focus on now. So that's kind of like how that strike happened. Yeah. Mm-hmm. If there are no other questions, thank you again for coming and for participating. I hope you have a nice evening. Okay, bye.